Well, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Well, as Jillian said, we have two texts to orient our thinking and reflection this morning. One from the prophetic writings of our Holy Scripture in the Hebrew Bible, and one from a modern-day prophet with a clarion call for justice. Our lectionary section this morning comes from the book of Amos. But before we get to our text, a little context is always helpful. This short book consists of 9 chapters and is largely a collection of the speeches and pronouncements of Amos, a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees from the countryside south of Bethlehem. Now, a quick aside, I will confess to you all that I had no idea what a dresser of sycamore trees meant, so I looked it up. Thank you, Google. It's an agricultural term for the process of pruning the thin stalks of the fig mulberry tree in order to help ripen the fruit more quickly and keep them from being destroyed by insects. So now you know too. In other words, Amos was a lay person, not a priest, who was called by the Lord to prophesy to the people of Israel and Judah. Amos, the book tells us, prophesied during the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and King Jeroboam of Israel, probably around the year 760 BCE. Now, these were relatively peaceful times for Israel, but also a time of great inequality, with the few rich getting much richer at the expense of the many poor. Old Testament scholar Gene Tucker describes the book this way. The message of Amos is direct and uncompromising. Over and over, he announces to the people of Israel that because of their social injustice and religious arrogance, the Lord will punish them by means of a total military disaster. Well, our passage today comes from the middle of the book, from the 5th chapter, starting in verse 18. And it starts with a word of lament and grief. Alas, Amos grieves for the people who are facing this disaster. Be careful what you wish for, he says. They yearn for the day of the Lord, thinking that their enemies will be vanquished when it is really their judgment day that is to come. And then Amos, speaking for the Lord, does not mince his words. The Lord says through Amos, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not even look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. Amos, this herdsman, this farmer, is speaking directly to the religious establishment on behalf of God, saying, I want no part of this. Stop with the performative worship and tributes. So what does God want instead? But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This beautiful, poetic verse is the crescendo of this passage. Justice and righteousness are familiar words and themes throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. But Amos draws the readers' and listeners' attention to this verse in a new, surprising, and very effective way. Hebrew scholar Ronald Hyman notes that justice and righteousness are paired more than 40 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So these words were very familiar to Amos's listener. Dr. Hyman describes the verse this way, quote, Amos 5:24 elevates the concept of social justice and the actions embodying that concept to primacy in the lives of believers in the Lord, with whom the Hebrews have a traditional covenant dating back to Abraham. Amos is not a radical. On the contrary, in his prophecies, he is part of his people's traditions, end quote. In other words, Amos is speaking words and themes that they recognize but have neglected in favor of their privilege and their comfort. The entire book of Amos, and this passage in particular, were very influential in the public ministry and advocacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When studying for his doctorate in 1952-1953, King made these notes on a little note card about Amos 5:21-24. He wrote, "This passage might be called the key passage of the entire book. It reveals the deep ethical nature of God. God is a God that demands justice rather than sacrifice, righteousness rather than ritual. The most elaborate worship is but an insult to God when offered by those who have no mind to conform to God's ethical demands. Certainly, this is one of the most noble ideas ever uttered by the human mind." King goes on in his writing, "One may raise the question as to whether Amos was against all ritual and sacrifice, i.e. worship. I think not. It seems to me that Amos's concern is the ever-present tendency to make ritual and sacrifice a substitute for ethical living. Unless a man's heart is right, Amos seems to be saying, the external forms of worship mean nothing. God is a God that demands justice, and sacrifice can never be a substitute for it. Who can disagree with such a notion?" End quote. Well, 10 years after his studies and after these writings where King reflected on Amos, the text remained a pivotal one for King, and he included it, as we heard, in his letter from the Birmingham jail. Well, I believe that this letter should be required reading in every civics classroom in this country. Amen. But I didn't read it as a high school student or even as a college student. I first read this whole letter as a first-year attorney when a partner in the Dallas law firm where I worked circulated it by email in the firm on Martin Luther King Day, as was his custom. And I'm grateful for that mentor and friend who introduced me to this majestic, patriotic, and challenging text. In a new biography titled King, A Life, writer Jonathan Eig describes how that this letter from King is a response to a statement issued by 8 white clergymen in Birmingham that had been published in the Birmingham paper on the day after King's arrest. The white clergymen called on black citizens to, quote, withdraw support from these demonstrations and instead unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. The ministers went on to write, "We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely." Well, King read this statement from solitary confinement in the Birmingham jail after his arrest on Good Friday, 1963, for leading a nonviolent protest march as part of the larger Birmingham civil rights campaign. Eig writes, "The clergymen considered their message a plea for cooperation, moderation, and reason. But King, who read the statement under the weak glare of his jail cell's light bulb, became disturbed." Eig goes on, "As King's mind spun, he set to work. He wrote on the margins of the newspaper, and when he ran out of room in the newspaper margins, he scribbled on napkins and toilet paper. Sometimes he used the paper in which his sandwiches had been wrapped." Well, we heard some excerpts from it this morning, but the entire letter is approximately 7,000 words long, or more than twice as long as the entire book of Amos. To give you an idea of its length, if I were to read the entire letter this morning instead of preaching this sermon, we would be here for 50 minutes. We obviously don't have time for that, but I do want to share this extended excerpt that is particularly searing and pertinent to our current context. King writes, "I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had this strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. King continues, in the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to say about. And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. There was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period that the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number but big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. King wrote, things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak and ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I meet young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. Therein ends this reading. But please take some time this week just to sit and read his entire letter. It is truly magnificent. I believe that Amos and King are both considered prophets, not only because they were willing to speak uncomfortable truth to power, but because in hindsight, we can see that their predictions about the future were fulfilled. 40 years after Amos prophesied, the Assyrians invaded and the kingdom of Israel came to an end. Israel suffered the total military defeat that Amos predicted. And 60 years after King wrote, which is today, we see ongoing injustice alongside the weakening of religious institutions and how each subsequent generation has become less loyal and more disgusted by the irrelevance and hypocrisy that they see reflected in religious and specifically Christian institutions. So what are these two prophets? One from 8th century BCE Palestine, one from the 20th century United States telling us today. For one, our worship, however meaningful, however beautiful, however fulfilling to our souls it may be, is just not enough. What we do on Sunday mornings is meaningless if we aren't working for justice and righteousness the rest of every week, every month, every year of our lives. God's desire for social justice is non-negotiable. in our world today is just as much in need of justice as was the world in which Amos and King prophesied. We live in a time of extreme inequality and extreme injustice that demands our active and, yes, extremist engagement. But our response must always be nonviolent. Those on the side of injustice and inequality are using extreme measures to hold on to their power at any cost, including violence. White supremacists are killing people in supermarkets, churches, and synagogues. Far-right extremists attacked the U.S. Capitol to try to overturn the results of the presidential election and threaten state houses around the country. And the threat of political violence only continues to grow. According to a new poll released by PRRI just a couple of weeks ago, quote, today, nearly a quarter of Americans, 23%, agree with this statement. Because things have gotten so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. That's up from 15% in 2021. PRRI has asked this question in 8 separate surveys since March 2021, and this is the first time that support for political violence has peaked above 20%. The world, the powers that be, want us to be moderate, to be moderated and controlled by the status quo. That's the dangerous allure of Christian nationalism that domesticates the power of Christianity into the small box of the nation. A few years ago, I talked with Walter Brueggemann, one of the most influential Christian theologians and scholars of our time, who has concentrated particularly on the prophetic tradition. And he commented on how Christian nationalism, quote, makes God a captive and domesticates God. And when God is domesticated, it really leaves us without hope. What's going on in U.S. politics is essentially a politics of despair, in which we believe that nothing radically good can happen, and therefore it's a scramble to get as many of the marbles in our pocket before the game ends. But that's a no-win strategy because in the long run, it diminishes everyone's life, those who are at the top of the heap and those who are underneath them. So what can our prophetic tradition teach us about how we will respond today? Dr. Brueggemann said, I think we have to be working at the reform of the church so that the church community really becomes a place of truth speaking rather than privatized otherworldly stuff. I think we have to be politically active. I think we have to be on the streets in protest. I think we have to be performing the truth that is entrusted to us in every way that we have the courage to do. In the words of King, when will the church stop being a mere thermometer of our society and system and start being the thermostat that can transform the conditions of our society? How can we dismantle the insidious ideology of Christian nationalism that keeps the church from realizing this true calling? And can we do it together before the world as we know it is destroyed? That's the prophetic question of our time. We are living in an extreme moment, and one that calls us to be extremists. Extremists for justice, extremists for love, extremists for the gospel of Jesus Christ. May it be so.